Hey there, it's Captain Jeff, SeaGrass Charters. Today, short video, and this is going to include a little bit of instruction. In the fishing video that accompanies this, you'll see that there's a lot of floating grass in the water. Not actually a whole lot, but just enough to be annoying. I seldom ever fish in water more than 3 or 4 foot deep. In this particular part of the world, that's where you're going to catch most of your sea trout, your speckled sea trout. They tend to live in that 3 foot area, give or take a little bit, depending on conditions. I fish a lot of topwater, especially early. Topwater is a great way to verify that the fish are where you think they are, and it's just a lot of fun. They haven't actually been hitting real well on topwater lately, but that's a different story. A typical topwater bait, you'll find hard bait, looks like this. This is a mirror lure, treble hooks. I always replace them with good hooks. Nobody puts good hooks on baits anymore, so I replace them with something that's a little stronger and a lot sharper. But the problem with that is a lot of grass, man. As soon as this thing gets a blade of grass on it, kills the action on it. Treble hooks are bad. They get a lot of grass, and then before you know it, all you're doing is you're bringing back a hairy torpedo. And the fish are rarely ever going to touch that. I think I've caught one shot in my life, and he had to have been really hungry. He was a little tiny one who hit a lure as I'm actually bringing it back as fast as I can to get the grass off, and one of them smacked it. But I would never count on that. Not a lot of grass in this video today, but it doesn't take much. Some people will go to single hooks. They'll replace them with something like this. That's a bait with a single hook, and this is a hook designed to be used on a hard bait. It does work better, but it still gets grass. Not as much grass, but I have not found that to be actually worth the time it takes to take the old hook off and put that hook on. It's just not that big a difference to me. So I will go to soft plastic topwaters. Fishing a plastic bait, soft plastic on top, so it takes a little bit more effort. There's no action built into the lure generally. You have to add that. A couple different kinds you can get. I'll show you. Here's a big one. This is, I believe it's a Bass Assassin. It's a huge. I don't throw this on trout normally, but this is typical. This is more your typical size here, 3 inches. They have a little groove in there. You can see it's hollowed out, and that's for your hook point. Something I like to use because it has a bigger profile, and we're trying to match the profile of the bait we're trying to imitate, is something called a DOA airhead. Now, I don't get anything from DOA, though I do take donations. This is a great bait. Again, it's got a cavity in there. It's got that broader profile. Most of the bait around here is kind of fat for their overall body length. The hooks you're going to use are basically like this. Looks kind of like a worm hook. Got a big wide gap on it. Rigging them with either one pretty much the same way. You just have to plan ahead. In this particular case, there's my gap. So I want to make sure that the hook is sitting in like this. So you just go through it. It's really simple. Boom, go in, I don't know, 1/4 inch, depends on the length of that little offset part. Come in. I've hooked this one several times. It's getting kind of beat up. And then go through the back so it comes out. You really want this to run straight as much as possible. What you end up with, that hook is completely covered. And the best part about this is this bait has a very deep cavity, and it's very soft plastic. So when a fish bites that hook is right there. With something that's a little skinnier, something like this, there's not a lot of cavity there. You have to use probably a hook with less of a gap, but then it makes it a little harder to get them in there. Some soft plastics don't have any of this cavity, and they'll work too. But the problem is it's harder to get the hook in the fish. You got to really yank on that thing to set that hook. I'm not using any weight with these, so it doesn't cast as well. And this is about as aerodynamic as a plastic brick. So I tend to use a very limber rod. I'm still trying to find a rod I really like, but so I need a limber rod to throw it, but the rod doesn't have quite enough backbone always to set the hook. So that's where these come in handy. No matter what you're using, when you're rigging it like this, when you're hiding that hook to some degree, it takes an aggressive hook set. Got Guys who bass fish will be right at home. That's it. Yeah, the important part, how you work this thing. Since this doesn't really have any action by itself, a couple of things I did, and this particular model, it works. I just snipped the tail there because it's coming through the surface. It tends to make a little more noise. What I will do is before this thing hits the water or immediately afterwards, I will start skipping it across the top of the water. I'm taking my rod tip, I'm reeling quick, and I'm doing this with it. So that's making that bait come through the water, just skipping, and it looks exactly or pretty darn close to a fleeing bait fish. And if the fish are around, quite often they're going to go after it at that point. They see that and go, oh, and I have seen, numerous trout and redfish will, boom, they'll often miss it because it is moving pretty quick. I've seen trout just arcing right over things. When you see that, when you get any kind of reaction, kill the bait. Just stop reeling it. So what's going to happen? It's going to be skipping along. You're going to kill it, and then it's going to just drift down like that. Like, oh, I'm running away, and now I can't run. Now I'm dying. Boom! They're going to come back and hit it as it's on that fall. If you don't get a reaction, I don't really recommend jerking it all the way or skipping it all the way back to you. I'd go 10 feet, stop, and then just start working like a normal jerk bait at that point. Which is not a lot. It doesn't take a big jerk on these things. It's just a little twitch. You're just barely taking up the slack. You can pull it a little bit better. I would experiment. I experiment throughout the day. Sometimes I'll give it a good tug and it'll go, or sometimes I'll just twitch it and it'll tend to go sideways and then it'll have that little fall. But that's really it. It has no action on its own, so you need to give it some. Again, throw that thing out there. A lot of people say that you shouldn't crank your reel over while it's going out. I don't know. I've never tested that. That's why they make the things that way. You can play with it. You can stop it with your hand, flip it over if you get practice with that. But as that thing's coming down to the water, say this is the water, when it gets right about here, I start bringing it back, and it hits that water, and it's skipping. And it looks for all the world just like a scared old little bait fish trying to run away from somebody. And it's just a lot of fun. Anyway, that's it. Appreciate it, and take care. It's Captain Jeff from SeaGrass Charters. Pretty. Here we go, about 18 and a half. Not a record, but a good fish. We see what we're trying to imitate here. I don't know if we can see in the camera, but little flashes right in there. Those are pinfish, sometimes alewives. When this lure is down there and it's dropping, it does the same thing. Yeah, you maybe see them all now spread out over here. That's what we're trying to accomplish, because when that's in the water and you're twitching it and it's floating down, it looks just like one of those, only a bigger one.
Here's a scene or two that illustrates why we kayak fish, because it's really quiet, stealthy. A boat that's this quiet costs more than my pickup truck. So it's all about access and bang for the buck. A couple turtles here. Turtles are pretty easy. They're actually pretty close. They're within about 6-7 feet. But in the next scene, there's a nice fish sitting down in this pothole right there, a little off to my right slightly. Yeah, he takes off when he sees me moving my hands around though, before I can get the camera in the water. But I could have touched him with my rod.